Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Kelly Monahan, who studies the impact of AI and the future of work. Kelly, you said I could just call you Kelly. Thanks for taking time to chat. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me today.
Can you give a quick intro about yourself and what
Yeah,
you do, and then we can get into the topic?
sure. So I've been studying the future of work. I'm a researcher at heart in my training. I started my career actually in the HR side of the business. And it was funny, about probably 15, 20 years ago at this point, and robotic process automation was coming onto the scene. And so I got into HR to develop leaders, engage employees. And my very first job was reduction in workforce because of robotic process automation. So since that period of time, I've spent time in consulting at companies like Deloitte and Meta, as well as Accenture, to really understand from a research perspective, what does AI, what do these new technologies mean for the workforce, and how do we begin to think about leadership differently as a result?
Perfect. Thank you for that. We've got like 45 minutes, so without
Okay,
further ado, we can jump right into the topic.
great.
Let's start with how AI is changing leadership.
Yes. That is a big one today. So I think most people think right now when we talk about AI that this is a technology moment. My research and my lens that I view this is, I think it's much more of a leadership moment. And the reason why I say this is generative AI in particular is democratizing experience and intelligence. Most leaders are where they are today because of their expertise, because of their 20 plus years of experience. But what happens when that becomes democratized? What value then do you then add as a leader? And I think that to me is why I think we're actually at a leadership moment, because I believe leadership needs to fundamentally change in light of all this new intelligence and all this new expertise that we have coming into the workforce in the name of generative AI, AI type technologies.
Kelly, so essentially, as I read these articles and
Yeah.
as things continue to change, there is an impact on just about everybody who's in this
Yeah.
white collared space.
Sure.
The magnitude of that impact is probably where there might be some differences, at least in these initial stages. I want to talk a little bit about mid-level management based on your experience and
Yeah.
people you're talking to. Not, I'm, as a software company, we are a software startup, but I'm
Yeah.
just not talking about the developers and the team that's actually doing the work at the operations level. And I'm not talking about senior management folks who are defining directions. We'll get to those two categories in a second. But we could start with mid management, and if you could draw a parallel between what they were doing in software companies maybe like 3 years ago and 5 years ago, what are you seeing them currently do? And last but not least, do you see them exist 3 years from today?
That's a great question. So, I used to work at Meta, and part of one of my research projects was defining how the role of middle manager was changing. Now, what I get a little concerned about as I see the tech industry in particular is this race to automate the middle manager level. I think there's a lot of thinking out there that thinks, okay, well, now we have AI. Why do we really need middle managers? I fundamentally disagree with that, and here's why. Where I see middle management changing is, previously it was very much managing up, managing down, being very much a communicator between both the levels. It was also executing on behalf of leadership's vision. What I think is changing today is it's becoming much more of an orchestrator of work. As we have agentic AI enter into our workflows, as we start actually redesigning work, as we think through, well, how would this job look now that you have AI technologies and tools at your fingertips? I very much see middle managers at the forefront of that. Now, what my research says is middle managers out of anyone right now in the workforce is the most burned out and also probably the most skeptical about AI right now, because they are being sandwiched between the middle of having to execute a vision that is not quite reality. The tools are not quite where some of the C suite and board thinks they are. And yet they're dealing with a workforce that's eager to stay upskilled and eager to start using these tools in their day job. So I believe middle managers will absolutely be a fundamental role in the next several years. I think it will look different though, and it has to look different. And for right or wrong, I don't know if this is good news or bad news for middle managers. It will be dealing a lot more with the messy human side of work. And so it will be dealing with the politics. It will be dealing with the social capital, all the things that AI cannot do. Middle managers are going to take a lot of that burden on in the organization.
Okay, there's little that you said there that I could disagree with, but let's dig a little
But you
bit
go. Yeah,
deeper.
let's go.
A little bit deeper. So you mentioned a lot of the product companies, correct? And
Yes.
I have been building products all my career,
Yeah.
so it resonates with me. But I also want to talk about non-product companies because
Sure.
things could be a little bit different. And just to
Yeah.
get set the context here, Kelly, most of the work I've done in my career, when I've worked with mid managers or having been one myself at some point in my career,
Yeah.
I've only known hands-on mid-level management in product companies, right? That's
Sure.
a given. I cannot think of very many scenarios, if any at all, that I've worked with somebody whose primary or exclusive job was to managing teams, orchestrating and coordinating, but actually not contributing to the code base in some way, form, or shape. But
Sure.
now that's not necessarily a case with managed services companies, consulting companies, perhaps government organizations, and things of that nature. So let me ask you the exact same question and
Okay.
appreciate your patience there. If you could speak to it from a non product company, like a mid
Yes.
manager who's not actually contributing to the code base, if you're talking software companies,
Sure.
what happens to that person?
So I think it's a fantastic observation you just made, because I think there is a big difference when it comes to the middle management layer when you're talking about product-based companies where they are actually contributing to the job itself. Like their expertise is why they're in the position they're in. What I see outside of that, oftentimes in other industries, is people become middle managers because of their tenure. When you think about the government model, right? It's after so many years you continue to go up that ladder. That I think is going to be a dangerous spot for employees today as AI comes onto the scene. The reason being is if you are not contributing to, maybe it's not product development, but service development, value add, customer development, I think that's going to be a hard time justifying your role in the future, to be honest with you, especially because what does AI do? AI actually becomes the unit of analysis, it's the deliverable. It can create documents much faster than humans. It can send more emails. It can schedule meetings. It can do all of the work that oftentimes is the busy work within organizations, if we're going to be honest, is some of the bureaucracy that exists. When that begins to go down, what then becomes a unit of analysis for managers? They have to become really good critical thinkers, create value, and then also become judgment, decision making. And how does decision making work? And so I do think middle managers, if they are not at the heart of decision making, adding value, I do think there's concern. And I think there's less concern on the product side just because of the nature of the role that you have really well articulated. I do think, though, as you start looking outside of tech, there's some concern there.
Makes sense. Historically, I say historically, but maybe even 2 years ago, right? Feels like
Sure.
history these days, but
Yeah.
as a mid-level manager, you were managing people, contributing to the code base, doing some hands-on stuff, and perhaps you had, depending on the type of product company, you may have had like 4 people, 5 people
Yep.
reporting to you, maybe something along those lines. A very basic question here, just to sort of again set the
Yeah.
foundation. If you had, say, n number of mid-level managers in this capacity of a product company that had like 5 to 7 people reporting to them, what percentage of those mid-level managers do you think there might be in the coming year or two?
So it's funny, and as it is, my PhD is in organizational behavior, and so I've spent a lot of time researching spans of control of like what is the right size for a leader or manager to manage, where there's still value creation happening, and you don't begin to scale beyond your area to actually have influence. And it's becoming interesting because again, I'm assuming a world where it's not just humans in the workflows, but that their managers are also managing AI agents and orchestrating that. That becomes a very different locus of control or span of control as we think about management. I actually have a hunch that we're going to need less managers, not more, in the future of work because of this. And I think the job is going to fundamentally change into much more orchestration and decision architect of how do we make decisions, what's the governance, who's responsible for the outcomes when everything becomes AI plus human driven. You don't need as many of that, right? And so I think that's going to be a really difficult question. I still think a good span of control is, no more than 7 to 9 per leader or manager. Like that's just what behavioral science tells us. But what happens when that's 7 to 9 humans plus 7 to 9 AI agents? Like I think that's going to be the future of research that we need to understand is how much can middle managers take on so it doesn't become a burden, but they're still adding value, they're still moving fast, and yet we haven't expanded their locus of control beyond their means, if that makes sense. So I still think it's an open question.
It makes a lot of sense because you actually literally stole the words out of my
Oh,
mouth,
okay.
Kelly, there, because I'm going to ask you about AI agents next. But
Oh,
now that you
okay.
mentioned, let's talk a little bit more about those. So
Yeah.
I think you articulated that beautifully. So as a
Yeah.
manager, whether you're mid-level or higher up, you're now not just managing Homo sapiens per se, you're managing a
Correct.
bunch of agents. And there is going to be a proliferation of these AI agents, right? It doesn't look any other way. And one of the things we do is we publish APIs to make other companies build software quicker as a
Cool.
company. And we're working on a fintech API. And I say this because, we watch the market closely. And if the
Yeah.
market's anything to go by, it's just been in a state of absolute frenzy. Like every
Yes.
single day, you have these memory companies like Micron's become a $750 billion company.
Right.
And I saw that CEO not too long ago when I was in DC, like walking out on the street, and I think they were like probably a $50 billion company. Like this was literally a year ago or something like that.
It's
It's just
insane.
crazy, right? So there's going to be a lot of these agents. Now, my question, Kelly, is say you have a reasonable mid-sized company, a large company, doesn't matter.
Hmm.
Who defines the breadth of the number, the quantity and
Hmm.
quality of these AI agents? And here's what I specifically mean by that. Let's say you have a bunch of managers and you have
Hmm.
teams that's building software. You need agents to make yourself more productive, right? To do
Yeah.
things that are not repetitive, and you're going to automate as much as you can. There are things that are common across teams and organizations within the company, right? Within different departments. And there are things that are specific to your team just because of
Sure.
the nature of work that you actually do. So now, if you think about agents as kind of not humans, right, but replacing humans to some extent, how do you, as a company, whatever that size, right, assume a reasonable size
Hmm.
company, how do you define the actual numbers of these agents? Because just like you define the number of people in your teams, you're going
Sure.
to have to define the number of agents because there's probably only so many you can kind of manage. So, how do you
100%.
define those? And how do you separate the agents that are common across teams and the ones that are specific to your team? And how do you just go about building this stuff really?
Yes. I think it's a $1 billion question for consulting companies today, what you just asked, and I love it. So here's how I'm thinking about it. I'm going to start at the very enterprise organizational level. This is why I think AI is a shared leadership roadmap today. So often it's still sitting within IT or change transformation. The reality is, though, this becomes very much an HR question, what you just asked. Like, that's where the experts are. HR is the experts in how do we design work? What's the right span of control? What is the right organizational structure for us to move forward and, obviously fulfill our mission and vision as an organization? And so I think this is actually one of the very first times in technology. HR wasn't really involved when cloud based technologies came out. HR has barely been involved in software, like maybe a little bit when it comes to like a workday type HR implementation, but oftentimes that has been very siloed part of the organization. This is the first time the CEO, CTO, CIO, CHRO all need to get in a room to actually problem solve with this various expertise. So I think at an organizational level, you will have a few AI agents that work on behalf of the enterprise. That needs to be a shared C suite agenda. But then as you start getting into actual functions and departments, that is where I think HR needs to play a very consultative, if not advisory role with these various business departments to figure out what is the expertise needed. Do we build or buy? I think that's going to be a big question for a lot of these companies as well. And then how many do you need? What I see happening and what I'm fearful of right now, companies are haphazardly using a whole bunch of different AI agents, like in the spirit of experimentation and testing, and it's creating chaos. And is actually the word I'm hearing now within organizations is I have more complexity, not efficiency, because of all these AI agents I'm trying to manage. And so the number one thing that I think organizations need to get right is to simplify. What are the AI agents at the enterprise level? What do we need at the functional level? And how do we make sure that we are actually driving efficiency and not complexity the more that we add to our tech stack?
Kelly, I've been building software for like over 20 years, and the
Okay.
overall structure, while the frameworks and libraries and languages have almost always changed, the
Yeah.
pace of change now is inarguably, dramatic. But
Yep.
the structure of teams, the composition of software teams as to who makes up a team has not changed as much over the years,
Right.
right? You had
Sure.
three developers, a part-time tester,
Yep.
a part-time product manager, and project manager, so on. And I'm just loosely throwing this out.
Right.
That has changed a little bit here and there. You didn't have DevOps years ago, then you have DevOps and then
Yep.
DevSecOps, and so there's new roles that come into play. But the structure was mostly intact. And I have my opinion, a thought or two about that, but I'd like to
Yep.
hear yours. Do you see in the next 6 months, a year or two, how do you see the structure of these teams actually change? Like, what are some I mean, do you see them change like dramatically where it doesn't even look like the same teams and roles? Or do you only see like, minor adjustments?
I was with a Fortune 100 chief information officer last week, and him and I were actually having this exact same conversation. And his view was the job is still the job. Like the tasks still need to get done, but how the work flows and maybe who's on point for certain areas is evolving and changing. But at the end of the day, you still need software engineers. You still need DevOps. You still need user design researchers and their expertise. And so I don't necessarily see the expertise that's required to produce great code or produce great products going away. That how though and how that's being produced, I actually think is it's changing faster. Over maybe 3 to 5 years, will that team composition look differently? Potentially. I'm just not sure though in the short term that I see a massive team structure shift as much as I see how they work differently. But I would love your input. You are much more closer to the ground to that if you see a bigger change happening.
Yeah, the reason I ask the question, Kelly, is let's say you take, we have a project management software. You're a
Sure.
small company, we have like four different products. You take larger companies, you're going to
Yep.
have 40 or 400 different
Yep.
products. And each of the teams say they're building, I don't know, web applications or mobile applications. Depending on the problem they were solving, you had a team that sort of helped you design this, what should
Yep.
the UI or the UX look like, and what artifacts do you create, and how do you pass it along to the dev team. And it was very traditional business as usual.
Yep.
But now, as these user interfaces are going to have to change, we're not seeing that dramatically happen at this point. But I
Yeah.
don't expect 2 years down the road that you're interacting with web applications the way you're
Oh, sure.
interacting with them today, or with mobile apps, or maybe the whole client is going to change. Maybe you're not downloading apps anymore, and not as many apps anymore. And perhaps a
Right.
lot of this is integrated into
Yep.
your other workflow and lifestyle of your business generally.
Yep.
If such things were to happen, the I cannot see the core structures of these teams stay intact, because that just wouldn't make any sense. You don't need a
Mm.
UX UI team at a per product level, because
Right.
maybe
Right.
maybe it's interactions and maybe it's conversational UI. So you have one very simple looking conversational UI page for the entire company. So everything happens through agents and things in the back end. So now you don't need 16 different UI UX teams and developers in those teams, which means I'm just wondering, tell me if
Yeah.
this seems fictional, but I'm wondering whether everything has to fundamentally change as opposed to gradually and incrementally changing it.
So this is, I think, the tension and friction point that most teams are under. And I see a little bit of a disconnect happening here. So, and I don't know if this is relevant to what you're saying. So I mean, we both know AI has been around since the 1950s. Like AI itself is not a new technology, but certainly the way that we've been able to, potentially get to this AGI we've got much more profound intelligence at our fingertips than we did even 3 years ago. And so I think leaders fundamentally know this and sense this. They are not developers, nor are they the ones actually using these AI tools. And so they are basically handing out Copilot license, Chat GPT, and telling the workforce, go vibe code, go redesign the way that, go rethink your job. And ultimately, they're trying to find cost out of the business. The concern is most individuals don't necessarily know how to capture value yet because we have not fundamentally rechanged the structure of the job. We haven't changed workflows. We haven't done any of the change management process that usually is like, again, I'm coming from consulting. You would take it probably right now an 18 to 24-month roadmap to actually get this moment right. Most executives are saying, well, what did you do next quarter? I got to get back to the board and report some sort of efficiency gain. Or, one CEO famously said to me, we've invested almost $100 million in AI tools. I don't even know what we're building. Like I don't even know now what to go tell the board. So that to me, I think is the problem is leaders are so bullish and excited that AI should be changing everything about work, but they are not doing what you just described, an actual rewriting of how the team structure looks, the expertise needed, and how the workflow works. No one has time or patience for that because we are moving way too fast and operating against too many priorities today. So the number one thing I tell leaders, you need 3 to 5 priorities. AI needs to become one of them, as long as with change management. And the second thing is you all need to align on what those 3 to 5 priorities are. Like that to me is actually where the friction is up top.
So you're talking about senior leaders here, Kelly. So I'm assuming, when you're talking to the press or when you have your
Yeah.
communications team, whether it's
Yep.
internal or external, you're going to have to say a few things to not that they don't mean it. I'm just trying to find the right words to say
Yeah.
here. You're going to have to make it sound more AI than there might even
Yes.
be, because that's the kind of the expectation, right? When you go to the
Yes.
earnings calls, you're going to have to mention the word AI like 17 different times, and the market's going to
Yes.
react accordingly, possibly. But like you said, the reality as to the dev team using it and doing it and becoming more efficient, I can tell you that there can be quite a bit of a disconnect there. So
Yes.
how does this marriage happen between, hey, I need to tell everybody that we are actually at in the forefront of AI, at the same time the spend is actually making sense, so you're not being penalized like every time Meta goes out there, they have
Right.
great numbers to report and their capex spend is through the roof and they get penalized. But then other companies who also have spent quite a bit of money and they're also hyperscalers don't seem to get penalized just as much. I mean, I don't know. I'm just taking an example of Meta
Yeah.
and maybe something else. But what are your thoughts on that?
So I think companies are at this like really interesting crossroads. So like let's take Meta as an example. They're getting penalized because their user base is not growing on social media. They have probably for their like traditional core products, they have likely reached market saturation at this point in time. Like I don't know, there's not enough people being born and joining Facebook as an example to like
Exactly. Yeah.
right, like so they're going to get penalized because their ability to continue to grow their core is limited. Most companies today, as we think about old tech stack world before generative AI, is in a low to no growth environment. Very few companies are actually operating. And that's because of macroeconomic complexities. It's not just AI. There's a variety of reasons why this is happening. Then, you've got investors saying AI should be cutting costs and then should be your growth lever. That should be causing growth. Well, you and I both know AI maturity is not there yet. All of a sudden, open up these brand new value markets, especially for these large companies who have tech debt. And so they can't just all of a sudden apply AI and find a new customer or grow their customer base. And so I think that is the challenge. And I'm going to call it for what it is. You were being very nice. I think a lot of leaders right now are talking BS about AI because they do know it's a 2 to 3x valuation gain, whether it's true or not. But if they can convince the market that they are now an AI enabled company, that's 2 to 3x overnight you're going to get in your share. But my concern is if you don't protect the core, like there's just still evergreen business sense that we've lost right now. You still need to protect your core. And my fear is, and I think again, why maybe Meta as an example we're using here, maybe getting penalized, is they are being not growing the core fast enough to explain the spend they're having on new growth opportunities through AI. Time will tell though. Amazon also, for a decade was bleeding and losing money, and they've created this phenomenal business model. So this will take time. My concern is not all companies have the cash though that Meta has to go after this in the same way. And so I think that's where we also see a disconnect outside of the tech industry of leaders feeling anxiety of, oh, am I behind? I don't have billions of dollars to go start building data centers and build my own AI models. What does this look like for me? And that's a huge question mark.
Um, when you look at how the market's reacting to this, right? I mean, what is that quote that says, the market can be more irrational longer than one can stay solvent, right? Something along
Yes.
those lines. But if you took that, the reason I mentioned that, Kelly, is uh, let's take SaaS companies for a second, right?
Okay.
Part of what we do is
Yes.
SaaS as well. So there's this whole term SaaS apocalypse, like it's
Oh,
Armageddon,
yeah.
and these companies are not going to exist. And then you see companies like Workday. You mentioned Workday,
Yep.
ServiceNow, Salesforce, Atlassian,
Sure.
Monday, Asana. I can think of
Yep.
Intuit. All of them taking quite a bit of a hit in the last 12 to
Oh,
18
yeah.
months or so. Atlassian reported earnings last week. They went up 40, no, not last week, maybe a couple of days back, if I'm not
Yep.
wrong. They went
Yep.
up 40%, and then they went up another 5%, I think, the next day. So they've caught up 50% of the way there, which means maybe the market isn't so sure either, because one day it's all doom because everybody's dumping all of these SaaS and software companies.
Yep.
And another day, everyone's happy to buy them back. And then just before I get your thoughts on this, I heard Jensen Huang say that if anybody who says, these companies are not going to exist as SaaS companies or software companies is probably not understanding the big picture. There is the need for those companies to exist. Maybe they have to change the way they do certain things and things of
Sure.
that nature. So I mentioned all of these things, the market, the tech leaders saying a bunch of different things, and the stocks going up one day and dramatically dropping the other. Where do you, as a person, as from a non-business standpoint, at a
Yeah.
personal level, what do you feel? Do you feel like we are still at the early stages of this curve that's really going to, boom? Meaning AMD that has gone up 100% this year is still not a whole lot, or do you feel like no matter how great things are, the stock markets doesn't seem to explain? Maybe I don't know. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on this?
So I think there's a lot of complexity. So I want to bring two areas of complexity here in this. The first is looking back at the hype cycle patterns we've seen with AI throughout the last 70 years. So, like, even I was posted on LinkedIn the other day, even if we go back to the New York Times article in 1985 said AI, artificial intelligence, was the most overhyped buzzword in corporate America. And it was supposed to do all the things. And it was just, no one even knew anymore where the technology was headed because it was supposed to do all things for all people. I think we're in a little bit of a similar hype cycle in terms of the media narrative right now as well. Of everyone's going to lose their job. To your point, there's going to be no SaaS companies anymore. We might have humanoid robots in the next, before we know it. And there's all this, again, just hype that's going on with that. But I also think the second thing that's happening is we look at like just the broader economics, no other areas within industries are growing. And so if you look at stock market performance as an example, it is being based and it's being held up by AI stocks. And so I think there's a lot of reason and why you're seeing a lot of this whiplash and momentum is if AI does not grow the way that we think within the US economy, that means our US economy is actually in a really terrible shape. We don't see growth coming from other sectors. And so that's the friction and tension we're navigating right now is I do think we're probably going through some sort of structural shift on how value is being created. It's shifting from labor to capital as AI does become part of business models. But we need other areas outside of tech to help bolster and really balance the economy right now. And so, anyways, I think it's against that complex backdrop why we're just seeing really probably irrational behavior right now. There is nowhere else to go besides AI stocks if you're trying to find this growth and really this hyper growth. And tech has been, as you look over the last 10 years, has been an area where you see the unicorns, where you can 5-10x your money. You don't see that in other industries the same way. So I don't know. I think I'm all about slow, steady growth over time. I think it's actually what creates healthy companies, healthy societies. I think we've lost the plot a little bit of where we are right now with AI stocks.
Great points you mentioned there. So, how can both things be true at the same time? And what I mean by that is, on one side, tech and AI companies, it's like there's no tomorrow in terms of how they've done, especially if you look at the SOX index fund.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just insane, like absolutely insane. So it's very concentrated. And like you mentioned, the other
Yes.
side, perhaps not so much. But let's say one of this is true, right? Let's start with AI
Yep.
being true. You don't need as many people.
Yep.
The agents are going to be able to do a lot of work. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's say we'll go with that as what we are seeing, right? There's layoffs
Mm-hmm.
announced by a lot of these companies,
Yep.
large companies, and we'll come to consulting and managed services in a second. But that's some truth. Right? I'm not making this up, right? It's there in
Right.
the
Sure.
news, layoffs and whatnot. If that's the case, the other side, what do they call it? The K-shaped economy or something
Yep.
like that, where the rich are getting richer, they have the money to spend.
Yep.
And I heard someone say this the other day: if the wealthy stop buying what they do not actually need, we're going to have a problem. And that was like, that
Sure.
was a dramatic thing to say, right? Wealthy stop buying
Yep.
what they actually don't need. On the other side, if people are losing jobs and there's not enough money, not everyone has all the money, who's buying stuff from say Alta, who's shopping at
Sure.
Kava, who's I don't know, who's doing the travel, who's taking the planes to see go different places. So but that those companies seem to be doing okay too. When airlines really reported earnings recently, and I did
Yep.
hear the CEO of, I think, Delta or United
Yep.
speak in DC, and I think they mentioned that things were looking quite good. How can both be true at the same time, Kelly?
So yes, I do think a lot of people are talking about the K-shaped economy or bifurcated economy that's happening, and I think there's probably a lot of evidence for that to be true right now. However, I think what's going to happen too is there's a lot of pressure on the middle class that I'm putting this in quotations of how we define that here and in our economy. That I think is going to be a lagging measure that we start to see some decline. So recently, like in the last couple months, there's been pressure at the gas pump. And so what happens when all of a sudden your commute now costs $20 to $30 more a week? For the upper class, it's not going to, doesn't matter. They're still going to take their private planes, fly wherever they want.
Right.
That is going to have an impact, though, on the majority of other people and how they live their lives and the choices they make. I think as we really come into Q3, Q4 of this year is going to be very telling to see whether or not we have a persistent K-shaped economy and we continue to see some of that downward pressure as prices become more expensive. And so I think it's gonna be really interesting. I'm also looking at debt rising. So we also know we're starting to see credit card spending increase, debt increase. Those aren't measures of a healthy economy or a healthy consumer spend. And so again, I think some of these are going to be lagging measures and what we see right now where things maybe look a little bit more balanced. We also just saw Spirit Airlines go out of business, this week, and that was pretty dramatic. And that was because of the oil price shock. They already had a pretty fragile business model, but something like that really fundamentally changes their ability to actually operate. I worry if we continue to have economic shocks persist throughout this year, we will see lagging measures in customer spend and customer health over the Q3 and Q4 of this year.
Yeah, makes sense because I think the crude oil today's Brent price is still over $100, but since it went to like $120 or something, I see articles that say, oh, the price of oil plunged. I'm like, really? It was like $64, I think, at the top of the year. How did it plunge? I mean, what are we talking about here, right? So you have to take all of this with a grain of salt because a lot of these articles that you read these days is also generated by AI.
Yes.
So sometimes, there's so much disconnect between the paragraphs. I don't know how people are creating these things. So, you have to take the good with the bad. So let's talk about, we got on the 20 minutes. I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask me anything if you do want to ask me at some point, Kelly. But let's talk about consulting and managed services.
Okay.
Where do you see that business go? In other words, a lot of these large companies, Accenture, or even the tech, consulting companies in India that make a lot of the money or almost all the money through consulting, doing business in the US and maybe other parts of the world. What do you see the impact on these companies? Because who's going to pay you top dollars for you to actually have somebody sit and generate code or have you sit and talk to Claude or, Codex and whatnot? While I, as the company in itself, could be doing that. Why am I paying a provider to actually do the job for me and pay them more money or 10 times more money than I might have to spend?
Yeah. I think it's actually going to be fascinating to see the way that managed services and consulting, I think as I think through different industries, I think certainly product development, software engineering, coding is fundamentally shifting and how that world works. Management and consulting is another one. And so there's two things that I get concerned about. One, I grew up in consulting, so I was at Accenture and Deloitte. And you grow up, it's called up and out in 2 years. So you basically, learn how to create PowerPoint decks in your first 2 years. Again, the unit of analysis here, the deliverable tends to be the PowerPoint deck that the client ends up actually getting at the end of a $100,000 engagement, right? I mean, it's like as you start thinking about what we're actually delivering. And you learn, kind of the consulting way by, doing that for 10 plus years. My concern is you don't need that junior consultant anymore to do that deliverable. AI can do it probably better, cheaper, and faster. How then do you actually still have a career pathway? And how do you actually get some of that industry expertise that happens along the way as you cut your teeth through PowerPoint decks and memos and documents and all of that? So I get really concerned they're going to have a big junior type pipeline issue because it doesn't make necessarily sense for humans to maybe be doing that work in 3 to 5 years. The second thing is we talked about with leadership, intelligence is what's becoming democratized with a lot of these AI tools. And that usually is what you hire a McKinsey or a Deloitte for, is the intelligence that they bring, from a consulting side. That's being disrupted. And so I think consultants are going to have to figure out, my expertise cannot just be technology implementation. It can't just be coding, to your point. It has to be the change management, the human side, the sustainability. They have to start thinking about bigger problems to solve for clients and customers. And we all know there is plenty of big, wicked problems, we used to call them consulting to solve for. I think consulting has to actually go after that and not some of the basic software implementations that typically have been the low-hanging fruit. And then finally, to answer your question about managed services, I think it's a huge risk. I think that is definitely an area that's going to go from outsourcing to automation pretty quickly. And I feel we think of the countries in the Philippines or India, where so much of economic opportunity has happened because of managed services. I do worry we're going to see extreme automation in some of those areas. And I just don't, where do those people go? Right. And how do we think through that? I do think organizations need to be responsible in thinking through the consequences of that.
So does that mean, we only live in a world that's got a fair bit of disparity? When we talk disparity,
Yeah.
people always talk about, I don't know, Asia or
Sure.
Africa or Southeast Asia. I've lived most of my life here in the US, and I think
Yep.
uh, we have just as much disparity, right? There's no
Oh,
difference. It's just the levels are different, but the
sure.
disparity is literally no different. But based on what you just said earlier, with the impact on consulting, I just want to ask you a
Hmm.
question that relates to disparity in some
Okay.
form, way, or shape. And hopefully, I'm able to articulate this well enough so it gives you an opportunity to
Okay.
actually help me understand this.
Yeah.
So, you talked about consulting, and let's say the world population is generally growing, I think, but
Yep.
it's growing in disproportionate numbers in different parts of the world. Like if you take
Correct.
South Korea or Japan,
Yep.
aging population in Japan, and people are not having children. So, the rates are going, I think there needs to be a certain number for the population to at least stay the same. But I think countries like Korea, they're not in that direction, right? They're going to
Right.
have fewer people in the coming years. India, I don't know what the state is, but it's the most populous, populated country, 1.4
Sure.
billion people, with about 70% maybe under the age of 30 or something like that. Really
Sure.
young workforce.
Yeah.
So there needs to be jobs for a lot of people. I mean, that's
Yep.
for a different country to solve that problem. But the thing I want to ask Ellie is, how do these things that happen in the other parts of the world trickle down and sort of affect us as a country? One side, you want to believe that, hey, we are immune to it, we are independent, none of this makes an impact, but you know that that's not necessarily the reality. So things changing, whether it's population dynamics or AI not, creating a lot of vacuum and jobs maybe not being there, maybe the price of oil going and
Yep.
going up, and all of those macro conditions, how do you at the higher level see them trickle down to us in the near future, or do you think we'll more or less stay protected?
I think it's a brilliant question. I study a lot of complexity science and systems theory. So I actually think right now, more than probably obviously any other time in human history, we are more interconnected in our economies than we've ever been. And so as we think about us here in the States, 90% of our goods and services are not coming from the United States themselves. They're coming from other countries like China, India, so forth. So, how their economies fare and how their labor is treated has tremendous consequences to the products and goods and services that are being delivered back here. And I'm not sure we always understand that circle. It's all a cycle. And likewise, what we end up outsourcing and shipping over there impacts greatly their economies. And whether or not we decide to use AI agents over managed service, it's going to have tremendous consequences for income and economic wealth. So I think there's a lot of interdependence. We do see parts of it right now, like we just said, with the Strait being closed and kind of some of the whiplash that's happening there too. That fundamentally changes everyone's dependent to some degree on oil. Everyone's dependent on some degree on the supply chain and the stability of that. And so I worry that we don't have a full understanding of the complexity behind just the bagel we go get for breakfast, a cup of coffee. Like that actually has tremendous world economic consequences, the way that it's being delivered. And so how will it show up practically for us as consumers or, as buyers of these things? Prices. I think we see that at the gas pump today too. I mean, prices certainly become a big impact of where we're able to spend our dollar. And if we spend more on certain, commodities, that impacts our ability to go have leisure and some other spending elsewhere. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this changes over time. I also think it's going to be interesting whether or not customers accept AI agents as part of the way the economy flows. We're seeing some early resistance and hesitation from some of the younger generation in fear of displacing people in particular. So I think there's a lot of open ended questions we still need to explore. But the bottom line is we are all interconnected today, and that will never go away. I don't see that future becoming less interconnected anytime soon.
Fair enough. If let's say someone tells you, Kelly, you're going to have to spend $1,000 lesser every month for the next 6 months, right? Just hypothetically,
Yep.
what are some things you would do differently as a person to save the $1,000? I'm just
Yep.
asking this to get a sense of where people are willing to make those adjustments, right? Some of it could be personal, but
Sure.
to a large extent, some of it is not personal, right? So anything that's
Yeah.
not personal that you might want to share with us, that hey, if I have to save $1,000 every month for the next 6 months, what are some compromises that you might be willing to make?
That's a great question. So, right now, where do I pay a premium? I pay a premium for convenience. And so that means there's going to be a lot less Instacart orders or DoorDash orders, right? You think about the fees that you pay for platforms and convenience and access. Do I really need an Amazon Prime membership? That could save me, whatever that's costing a month. You think through a lot of the entertainment that we pay for. So, Netflix, Disney Plus, Apple TV, Pandora, Spotify. Like we just all of a sudden start having, probably, if I were to add up all the subscriptions, are probably closer to $200, right? Do you really need all of that? And so I would start looking for areas of convenience that is a privilege to have access to in many ways. Then I'd also be looking at areas of entertainment where there might be access and just things that you've signed up for that continue to hit month over month that you maybe not even watching or aware of. I also think that means too, as you start talking about $1,000 a month, that means no new car payment. I think that is continuing to pull back on any sort of net new goods or big purchases that I may want to make, or it may want to be driving a nicer car, but my 2019 SUV is going to have to kind of remain with no car payment. And then as I think of anywhere else, of really where to cut, I think also would probably be in travel. Of looking like if I take 2 trips a year, that might now be 1 trip a year. And I think that's where, for me personally, those 3 areas are where I'd be looking to cut.
As we have like a few more minutes to go,
Yeah.
one of my last questions too, and then I'll let you
Sure.
ask me anything.
Okay.
So when I looked for my first job, which feels like a
Yeah.
100 years ago at this point, there were a few things I was tested on, which is, hey, do we understand what Krish is saying? Because we need to
Okay.
have reasonable communication. Is he able to think fast enough to be able to write this code? Is he familiar with this particular language? How can he
Yep.
contribute? And so on and so forth. Fast forward those 100 years today, if I were to hire myself, I wouldn't
Mm,
even ask those same questions. If I don't speak
right.
English, perhaps I
Doesn't
can
matter.
have a tool in the middle that does the translation. If I
Yep.
don't write code, who cares? Use some vibe coding tools and generate the code. So a lot of this is automated, or you have agents to do the job, and everything else that's outside your agencies that can help
Sure.
you do. So then how do we differentiate ourselves? We have a growing number of people when it comes to population, more people looking for work, less
Yep.
things to do for the time being at least. So how can people stand out, whether they're graduating from college, or if they're switching careers, or if they've done this for many years?
Yeah. It's fascinating to think about, especially when you start thinking about like knowledge work. It's not just the human labor pool anymore we're going to be competing with. It is going to be agentic AI coming in and being able to do like research. As an example, I'm a researcher. AI is really good at research right now.
Right.
Like so much so that we're like now sending surveys to AI agents and not even people because it's just we figured out, anyways, how to personify that. So I think for me as a human, we have to get back to things that will, I believe, always remain human. And those often are things that we have shied away from or not necessarily put at the same pedestal with STEM as I think about it. So that is going back to the humanities and thinking through empathy, wisdom, judgment, creativity, innovation. These are all things that we actually want more of in business, but we often never have cultivated that. Like, I don't know of any company who has created a wisdom training program for their employees to think through during unusual circumstances or complex times. What is the right decision here, and how would you problem solve and think through that? And then the second thing that I think is really important. So not only do you have your human qualities that we've forgotten, maybe is probably the right word there. The second thing then becomes, how do we make sure from a human to human perspective, we will always need human community. We will always need a level of in-person experience that can never fully be replicated in the metaverse or, through Zoom calls, that sort of thing. And how do we begin to double down? And those are going to be in areas of healthcare and education and social services. Like those things we still need for a healthy functioning society. And I think the big problem or equation of our time is, I believe we've over rotated a bit on technology and STEM at the expense of the dignity and value of other jobs and professions that actually are much more immune to AI automation. So I think it's going to be a really difficult transition for us to think through. If I want to future proof my career, it's maybe not by becoming a software engineer or coder. It may actually be becoming really good in healthcare or education or doing something with my hands in the trades. Those are areas we actually have like tremendous labor shortages in any ways. And so this might end up balancing itself. But how do you tell Gen Z, hey, you know what, being a YouTube influencer is actually not the ideal career path. It's being a plumber, electrician. You men probably will end up making a lot more money that way. We just have to look at, that's a big mindset shift, I think, for most people today.
Wow, incredible. You said that beautifully. If I have to have said that half as good as that, I would have had to rely on 10 different AI tools and then I would have still not
That's not
said
true.
it anywhere close to how you said it. So thank you
What
for
was a good
that.
question?
Thank you. My last thing I want to ask you is about
Yeah.
food, but that's simple or difficult
Okay.
depending on how you look at it. But
Okay.
before I did that, you have 5 minutes. Is there something that you want to ask me, Kelly?
I would love to know, from your perspective, because you've been building technology for a long time, what is the optimistic AI future that you're trying to build? Like, what does the future of work look like to you at Snowpal?
Wow, so I'll tell you very specifically with what we are currently doing, right? Say we're building
Okay.
APIs and we're trying to help other
Yeah.
businesses go to market sooner. Now, how do we make our APIs? They had RESTful integration, right? It's RESTful interfaces. We're
Yep.
working on, say, a model context protocol server, MCP server, so other AI agents can actually consume our APIs and endpoints without a human being
Oh,
involved,
cool.
right? So that interaction is going to have to look different as well.
Yep.
In addition to
Totally.
humans using it, it's AI agents needing to use it. That's making
Interesting.
improvements to our existing offerings. But that's different from thinking about fundamentally different problems that, our roadmaps change quite a bit. Things that were on a roadmap like a year ago
Yep.
cannot be on the roadmap anymore because it's one thing to use AI to solve your current problems, which is all right, which you still have to do. But it's
Yep.
entirely another to think about problems that you could possibly have not solved otherwise, but you
Sure.
can actually now fancy doing those because you have these AI tools available to you. So as a smaller company, whether we've never had to raise money, it's been bootstrap
Yep.
funded. That has been, it was a lot more difficult in the past because we are a
Mm,
smaller team, but we still back ourselves to doing it.
sure.
But now going forward, I don't know if the need to raise money is anywhere near it was before. You could actually be a really small team that's committed and focused and use the right set of tools and get things done in dramatically
Yeah.
quick fashion. So,
Totally.
in other words, being able to compete with larger companies in the tiny little
Huge.
things that they do has become more possible. But
Yes.
that also means, Kelly, I think there has to be a mental shift because a lot of times as engineers, we have this muscle memory where you do things the same way you've done in the past. Even if
Yep.
you're writing code in a different language or generating code or whatever, you tend to take the same sort of approaches because you've done them for a long time. So I think the key to people like me who've been in the industry a bit is how quickly can you unlearn what you've learned.
Mm,
That's the key part because if you keep sticking to what you've done,
yep.
it's now going to hold you in good stead.
Yeah.
I think it's easier said than done. Using tools,
Sure.
finding the tools is not difficult, but finding the right set of tools that make the most sense to you as a company and spending the least amount of money on tokens
Yep.
while you're using those tools is where the new skills are going to have to be. The skill is not writing code in a certain language or thinking an algorithm. The new skill is how do I solve this problem better using the current suite of people, agents, technologies, and the changing
Yep.
dynamics of the larger world that's out there. At least that's one of the ways we are looking at it.
Love it. Absolutely love it. I think that is also very brilliantly said. That might be your snippet you take for social sharing. That is what the new skill set is of the future for sure.
Thank you. The last thing I want to ask you
Yes.
is you're going out for dinner. What would
Yep.
be your ideal order for an appetizer, entree, and dessert? It doesn't all have to be part of the same cuisine. It could be
Okay.
coming from different cuisines.
All right, so three-course meal. First, I love a good sushi roll for appetizer. So I'd probably go a little bit more Japanese cuisine for the appetizer. When it comes to the like main course, I'm Irish girl, so meat and potatoes is probably going to be what I gravitate towards. So some level of like a nice steak and potatoes and salad, and then for dessert, I love cheesecake. So a good New York style cheesecake.
I don't think you're going to save those $1,000. I'm sorry.
It's not. I got exactly. What do
Yeah.
they say? I've got a champagne taste on a beer budget. So
Yeah, lovely. This is amazing. I know we
cool.
have a minute. Anything else you want to
Yep.
add, Kelly, or you could have your closing comment and we could call it wraps.
Yes. So I would just add, for your audience, if they're interested and loved our conversation today, I've got a new book coming out this September. It's called Reclaim the Plot: How Leaders Rewrite the Story When AI Rewrites Work. And so I think, like I said, I think today it's so much more of a leadership moment. And I think leaders are stressed and having a hard time figuring this out. So, anyways, welcome people. I've wrote it from a fictional company. I've been in tech for a while, consulting. I've seen a lot. So certainly don't want to name any companies, but I've seen the patterns of leadership that occur as we chase new technologies at the expense of people. And I just don't know if you feel the same way. I do think this moment is so critical and will shape for generations to come the decisions we make of how we use AI today.
Thank you. Stay on the call for a minute after I
Okay.
give a reintroduction. Thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Kelly Monahan. Kelly, everything that you've shared here about how AI is changing leadership and the disconnect between the C-suite leaders and
Yeah.
workforce and everything else we talked about, economics and micro and macro. I think we just stopped shy of geopolitics. It was amazing.
True.
Yeah.
It's another podcast.
Yeah, thank you. We'll include the links, to your
Okay,
profile,
cool.
your website, and I'll grab the link to your book as well. So we'll add it to
Thank
the
you.
podcast. Thank you
Awesome. Thank
very
you for the
much. So,
time.
folks, definitely check out Kelly's profile and the book. Until next time, thank you so much.